Alright everyone, welcome to my live stream. This is Keller. Normally doing bugs, but tonight I'm doing something different. I'm working on a leafy sea dragon. So one of these critters. I like working on organisms that are, it's hard to believe that they exist in the same world that we do. But this is what I'm going to work on. Looks like a concept design that would be rejected by most art directors, but it's accepted by nature. So there you go. Evolution's the greatest art director. Anyways, so what I'm going to focus on, I mean, clearly I had the model is been developed for quite a while. I actually originally started this a couple years ago for a client, and at the time it was meant for like a 3D printing thing, but I recently dug it up and decided that I wanted to paint it and make it all pretty. I have a few sea dragons in my portfolio, but this one is by far the most elaborate. And so I started painting it. I'm going to continue to paint tonight because there's a lot of great poly painting techniques that I like to use in ZBrush, and I'm going to share them with you. I love poly painting in ZBrush. Way back when, poly painting has always been great because you use the same brushes that you use in ZBrush, and they're quite flexible. And even though I use Substance Painter and more recently Marmoset tool bag, I still do my base coat, albedo, diffuse, whatever you want to call it, those types of maps using ZBrush and Polypaint. So as you can see, I've already painted a lot on this, but I don't consider it done yet because I don't quite have that beautiful, I mean, look at the colors in this thing. So this is my reference images. So there's some sea dragons down here. There's a ruby sea dragon, and then this particular species, I forget the name of the species. And I've collected a few images online. I've decided to use this one as my primary inspiration, and that was just because I decided on it. But I also like this one a lot too. I just love these colors. This is, So a couple of things that I like to do when I'm poly painting. I do poly painting after I've done a lot of the sculpting, because I like to take advantage of a lot of the detail that's already in the model. So I've already done a fair amount of detail on here. Let me get my reference out of the way. Even including noise and that kind of stuff. And I like to use that when I create masks from that so that I can create sort of a base coat of noise. So I have a base coat on here of greenish colors and hues, and I'm blending them together. And so I just go over and over and over again with successive passes until I feel like I can't do anything more. Or my general rule is like, once you get to the point where you're making things worse, then you know it's done. So, a couple of things that I like to do. I'll hold the shift key for my smooth brush, and I'm going to turn off Z add because I don't want to smooth any of the detail that I've already created. And I'm going to leave on RGB. This turns the smooth brush into a blur brush. So I might lower that RGB intensity. So by lowering or raising the RGB intensity, you're basically controlling the strength of the blurring. So if I set this up to say 100 and hold the shift key and brush over this, you can see it's very effective at blurring those colors together. That's a bit too strong. So I might bring this down to like, let's try like 45. So this is kind of nice. It's blurring it, making it look a little bit less like pixelated noise, and merging those colors together. And I'll just go over in successive passes, blurring and adding more color on top of it over and over again. And you can see that I'm blurring a lot of oranges and yellows and greens, and that's based on what I see in my reference. Sometimes it's a bit arbitrary, and sometimes I have to kind of go back and, well, that's why I do passes over passes over passes until I get it right. I don't know if I'm going to be able to match this exactly, mainly because the anatomy isn't exactly the same. I think a lot of these lobes, I'm not an expert in sea dragons, but a lot of these lobes obviously do a lot for camouflaging the organism. So I think that between individuals in the species, there's probably a fair amount of variation. And I believe I had specific reference when I started this, but I don't know if I have that reference anymore. So I'm kind of working on the tail right now, and I like how this has this kind of yellow kind of rim to the edge here, and a little bit of noise there. And then we also have this sort of blending here. It almost looks like, well, it looks like leaves, right? Hence the name. And I've gone over and added some of this detail that you see here on the tail. I'll probably add a little bit more. That's kind of where I'm at. So I don't feel like I'm finished yet. I feel like there's more to do. The other thing that I'd like to point out, and that I hope I'm going to try and demonstrate at some point tonight, is that this model right now, this individual subtool is at 40 million polygons because I have an expensive computer, that's why. So might as well use it. But I do intend to actually render this probably in Redshift for Maya or something like that. And I do want to export texture maps for this. And if you notice, if you look at my reference here, you can see that some of these fins, these fin-like structures, have, this is very transparent, right? So I don't have this transparency in here, so I'm going to paint a separate map to do that transparency, which I've already done for some other sea dragons, and it works pretty well. So I have some colors on this fin here, but I will repaint another map that will be black and white that I'll use for the opacity map when I render this in Redshift. But what that means is this model is going to require UV texture coordinates if I'm going to use more than one map. In other words, if I just sent this over to Keyshot, right, I could just use the polypaint data directly in Keyshot. Or even if I export it as an FBX, I could use that polypaint data. But this model does have, I believe, subdivision levels, if I remember correctly. So if I go down to lowest subdivision level, the lowest subdivision level is 620,000 polygons, which is still a bit, on the extreme side. But you can see the topology is not that bad for what this is. I mean, I don't think I'm going to rig or animate this. Even if I did, it'd probably be a very simple rig. But it has okay ZRemesh topology. But you can see I've split this all into polygroups, right? So I went in and I spent a fair amount of time splitting this into polygroups, and then when I Z-remeshed it, I used the Use Groups option, so you can see that on the borders of these polygroups there are okay edge loops, given that it is Z-remeshed. So I'm going to use these polygroups as a way to create UV shells here in ZBrush. So I'm going to do that a little bit later on tonight, but I want to get into painting first, and so I'll talk about that later. Because you can make UVs at any point during the process. You can change UVs whenever you need to. It's very flexible. ZBrush is an extremely non-linear tool. And when I teach ZBrush, one of the things that is a little bit difficult to get across, although it's a little bit easier these days than it used to be, is that it's not a linear thing. It's not like you start the model and you're on a trajectory and you have to follow that trajectory exactly all the way to the end. ZBrush is non-linear. You can change things at any point, and using projection and history and all that kind of stuff, come back and incorporate those changes into the model without having to redo a whole lot of work. So, I'm looking at the chat through OBS, so I think that I see everybody's chat. Last time I did this, I missed a lot of people in the chat, and I apologize. Especially to Tomas, because he was trying to make fun of me and I missed all of his jokes. So sorry to say that, Tomas, that I missed you harassing me. But hopefully I'll see your harassment tonight. So Tomas does a Monday night stream, so if you haven't caught it, he does a great live stream. So you can see I've got kind of a noisy bit right here. So let's take a look at some of the brushes. So the material that I'm using is this Skin Shade 4 material, because it's flat white. The brush that I'm going to use is the paint brush, this one right here. And I'll switch between using color spray and several different alphas to kind of create different types of blending. And I'll probably bring my RGB intensity down a little bit. So I'm going to start with freehand, and I'm going to sample some of the colors I already painted on here just by holding over the mesh and pressing the C hotkey, so that samples whatever colors underneath the cursor. So I'm going to get this kind of pale color in here. And for the paintbrush, I might turn on Z add just a little bit so that I can get a little bit of, a rise out of the surface. I mean, the paintbrush itself is really kind of like just a glorified version of the standard brush with Z add turned off. So I'm going to go in here, press O for focal shift, lower the focal shift a little bit, so that I can get a nice hard edge. And I wanted to say hello to Irene. It's always nice to see you. Thanks for coming in and checking out my stuff. I really appreciate it. I know you're a fellow lover of animals and biodiversity. So I'm just kind of going in here and playing with this kind of like edge detail, and I'm being a bit loose with it too. And I'm going to turn up my Z intensity a little bit so I can get a little bit of distortion along the edge so it doesn't look so clean. And then I'll hold the Shift key. Another great technique when you're poly painting for using the smooth brush as a blur brush is I'll go into the brush palette here and I'm going to scroll down to smooth brush modifiers, and this alt brush size, I'm going to bring this up a bit, maybe to like 2 or something like that. What that means is that when I hold the Shift key, the blur brush is twice as big as my current drawing brush. So it's a multiplier. And I like that because it allows me to kind of blur a little bit beyond just the stroke that I'm doing. So I'm just kind of blending colors here. And I also, this model is not, I've lost symmetry a long time ago, so it's not symmetrical, which means I have to do every individual leaf on here, which is not so bad. Let's go down here and do some of the parts that I haven't done yet. The other thing I can do is, let's isolate some of this so I don't have to have the entire creature in my way. Well, if this is polygroups, I'll just hold Control and Shift and Control and Shift click on that. And there we go. Now I can just focus on this and do a little bit of blurring. Let's take a look at the reference here. There's even a bit more detail in here than I have, so we can always do this. Get my move brush in here. I think some of these are a bit on the thick side. So my Shift D, go down a little bit. Maybe take my clay tubes and just kind of gently flatten this a little bit. Make sure that my clay tubes brush doesn't have RGB because I don't want to mess up any of my painting. So I'm just kind of thinning this out a little bit by holding the Alt key. And a little bit too much. There we go. It's nice and flat. Press D to go up to the highest subdivision level. And go back to my paintbrush. Just get a little bit of kind of nice leafy disturbed quality along those edges. I think most of the time my goal is to make it look not like it's something I created on the computer. So these little distortions and that kind of stuff really help with that. The nice thing is, like, you know, so I may decide, you know, to use displacement maps or whatever if I render this in Redshift, but if I'm not going to animate this, if it's just for a still image, I might also decide to decimate it so that I can keep as much detail as possible. The nice thing about decimation is that it does a really good job. If you turn on the preserve UVs for decimation master, it does a good job preserving those UVs so that you can still use the same, you can create texture maps based on that and use that on your decimated model in your render if you're just doing like a still image. So it's kind of a nice feature. I use it quite a bit, especially when I'm doing stuff for like scene elements, rocks, and trees, and that kind of stuff. UVs are still not obsolete. I know everybody's been, for a long time, everybody's hoping that UVs would finally go away because nobody likes making them, but they're incredibly useful. And I got over my hatred of UVs a long time ago. Now I embrace them fully. I haven't really gotten into PTEX. I know people like that as well. But sometimes I'll use, like, you know, polypaint, vertex, color data. If I'm rendering in KeyShot, that's when I'm feeling lazy and I need to render out, or I need to show something to a client and I don't have time to mess with UVs. But UVs are actually really easy to make in ZBrush. You just use polygroups. So I'm going to switch to color spray and do a little bit of cleanup here so I can get this a little bit tighter with some green. So I'm going to switch to color spray. And one thing I want to point out is in the options here for the stroke type, I'm going to set color to 0. This color slider randomizes the hue. So if this is too high, I'm going to get like rainbow sparkles, which I don't want. So I'm going to set this to 0 so that the color is not randomized. And I might lower the placement a little bit. So that's the overall spread of the spray. So I'm going to lower that so it's a little bit tighter. And then maybe I'll start with this alpha and get like a green color in here. And just kind of, oops, let's turn off Z add. And tighten this up just a little bit. I don't want to completely obliterate the colors underneath. I just want to kind of do a light coat on top of them so it looks like there's subsurface color. So this is another way to blend colors in addition to using the blur brush, is to just do successive passes. The other thing I've noticed, you know, if I render this in another program, a lot of these color variations that look somewhat dramatic here in ZBrush are going to end up being very, very subtle when you start to include things like translucency and subsurface scattering in your shader. A lot of that detail, so I think it's fine to kind of keep it somewhat exaggerated in the contrast. So maybe I'll make this a little bit darker, so that there's a bit more of a contrast. Okay, so I'm liking how that's looking. And cover up the stretch marks a little bit. Thank you, ZBrush. That means it's time to drink a beer. Yeah, so a lot of times I'll fiddle around and it'll take me a good, sometimes half an hour or so before my brain starts to get into the real poly painting mode. But once it starts to click, then it feels good. So this is starting to click a little bit early. Of course, I have been ZBrushing all day on other projects, but this is the kind of thing that I'm going for. It's not quite a perfect line. There is a bleed, there is noise, but it's still a little bit tighter than, say, what I have down here. So I want to have that tightness, and of course I also have to do the other side. The other side's not looking too bad, though. There's a lot of parts to this little critter. So I've been working on it for a while. And like I frequently say when I do live stream, it's like doing an animal like this is always good. If you're a creature designer, you got to do animals like this and do them as faithfully as you possibly can, because you're always going to learn something cool that you are not going to learn from just copying other creature designers. The best creature designers are the ones that really absorb from nature. As a great man once said, to have output, you must have input. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? So I'm going to leave some of that yellow-orange color. I like the fact that nature really embraces contrasting colors a lot. Or, what should I say? Complementary colors. So if you have a lot of green, you'll see a lot of orange. You just look at this right here, and you can kind of start to see the opposites. And you have a nice color wheel in here. Hold on a second. Here it gives you sort of a fair amount of idea of the color wheel. I think on my to-do list, after I finish some of the projects that I've started, I'm going to go back and do a few more cephalopods. And I haven't done a decent cuttlefish, so I might do a cuttlefish. I have a really nice sea hare model going as well that I need to paint at some point. The sea hares are really wild. They're just big blobs of frilly, floopy, floppy fun. So I've noticed in some of this, around the corners, we get this dark blue kind of color, which I like. I don't know if that's a photographic artifact or if that's actually on the model, but I think there's also, we have this, which is a nice little stem here that's bright yellow, but it has a darkness right there. So I might try bringing some of that kind of quality in here. So I'm going to get a darker blue. And I'm going to switch my alpha to, say, you know, one of these little dots here. And let's see if I can get kind of in this elbow right here, some of that darkness. That also helps to bring out that line there. And maybe bring up my RGB intensity a little bit. All right. Let's get some really dark colors in there. There we go. Hold the shift key to blur this a little bit. And see, that's starting to look a bit more organic. For a while, the early coats in this process, and it definitely looks just like speckled airbrushing. It really takes a while. You have to have faith that as you add more coats, things will start to look more natural. But for a while, it's always going to look kind of unnatural and weird. I learned a lot of I took a class way back in the day at Noman. It was taught by Madeline Spencer. That was just focused on texturing in ZBrush. So I learned a lot of techniques from that class. Really great teacher. And it was also a fun class. And I believe that's where I met Ara, who you guys might know as Kermako. He does also as a live streamer. So we go way back to early days. That's, I think, ZBrush 2 days before they even had subtools and all that kind of stuff. And some of these just dark splotches here and there. Another good animal to check out is the planaria are really interesting. See, now it's going through, which is great. That saved me some work since this is nice and thin. Also, nudibranches are great too. I have some nudibranch models that I need to finish. They're really wild. They look completely otherworldly. Everything under the sea is really awesome. That's where it all came from. So no more accusations, just friendly crustaceans under the sea. Okay, I think I've gone a little bit too far with that. That's okay. I'm going to get this lighter aqua color. And my RGB intensity, maybe go back to that more finer spray, and then go over this again. Just to do some blending. And I'm starting to get the kind of the colors that I want. Blurring. I like to do a little blurring and then painting on top of the blurred paint with a little speckling. That tends to sort of imply almost a subsurface kind of quality to it. If you do it enough, it can get really interesting looking. Yeah, that's looking nice. I like that. So another thing I'd like to bring in is this very faint kind of, almost looks like leaf veining kind of quality. So I'm going to switch back to freehand, and let's do an alpha like this, and I'm going to select maybe this yellow color, bring down the RGB intensity just very lightly. Okay, that might be too light. Blur, blur, blur. Get some of that aqua going on the other side. So C to select that color. Let's do the color spray. Bring down the RGB intensity and go to the opposite side here and just kind of lightly paint over that to blend it. This is why I like poly painting though, because of the blurring, and it's just easy to use these alphas with the different stroke types. I haven't really quite been totally satisfied with the way the brushes work in Substance Painter, having used ZBrush for so long, or even Marmoset. I mean, they're good brushes. Maybe I don't use them quite enough. The advantage of using something like Substance Painter or Marmoset is that you're painting on UVs, so that the resolution of what you're painting is independent from the resolution from the model. Because one of the limitations of ZBrush is, the reason I have my full model at like 40 million is because I need as many points as possible to get in these subtle gradations in color, since I'm painting directly on each and every vertex. So that is a limitation. It means that you have to have a really dense model, as opposed to painting on UVs, which you can have a low poly model, but a really high resolution texture map and well laid out UVs, and then you don't have to worry about it as much. But that being said, I still find that the brushes in ZBrush, even on a really dense model like this one, have much more of a, for me anyways, a faster feel about them. Maybe I just know them better. I don't know. But I don't like, it's like the lazy mouse and Substance Painter. I don't really like the way that works. And I don't like the, I'm going to turn on Z-Add for my smooth brush for a second, because this is a little too pinchy. Let's go down. That's a little too pinchy. Smooth that out. There we go. And I've never been satisfied with the blur brush in either of the 3D painting programs compared to ZBrush. What was a really great painting program was Painter, not Substance Painter, but what was Corel Painter. What was originally, way back in the day, what was the name of the company? I used to use their software all the time. Can't remember the name of the company. It was Meta Creations, but before that it was something else. I'm talking like, late 90s, early aughts. I used to use it a lot. But Painter was, competitor to Photoshop, and it was a really great program for a long time until it got overly complicated. They put too many features in it, and I think that killed it. And plus, it kept changing hands in terms of what company owned it. It was owned by Corel for a while. But it really was a fantastic and organic painting program, and I remember it had some really great smudge and blur brushes that were just awesome. And I've never found a program that had as good a distortion brush as Painter. And way back when I was taking classes at Noman in Hollywood, I took classes from a concept artist known as Puddinhead, who is an amazing painter. He doesn't do concept art anymore, as far as I know. He is strictly a fine artist now. But he used Painter almost exclusively for his concept art, and he was so good at it, and just had the most amazing creations using that program. And I learned a lot from him. But unfortunately, I guess Painter went the way of the dodo eventually. Maybe it's still out there. I don't know. I haven't looked it up. But I remember it just got way too complicated. It's kind of like the same problem that I have with Adobe Illustrator. There was a time when Adobe Illustrator had exactly the right number of features so that you could do really great artwork in it without being bogged down. But nowadays it's like I open it up and I don't know what's going on in that program anymore. But then again, I don't do that style of artwork. I don't do graphic design that much. All right, what's going on here? I need to get... There we go. The weird thing about software is that it constantly needs to innovate in order to survive. In other words, in order to get you to buy it and keep upgrading, keep getting new releases, it has to add features to stay competitive. And that's completely understandable. In the case of ZBrush, their new features are almost always awesome and amazing. But sometimes with other programs, sometimes the marketing gets ahead of what people really want out of the program. I've seen that happen with a few programs. It's kind of unfortunate. Okay, I think I've kind of killed this thing. I'm spending a lot of time on that. Let's take a look at the whole. Let's take a look at the head for this thing. Do a little step back. So you can kind of see, I mean, this leafy area right here, I've got more detail on it now on these edges. That's a little pinchy there, so I gotta fix that. A little bit more darker variation, more green. If we look at this, which is sort of in a before state, you can kind of compare and contrast. I'm liking the way this is looking. Even though the difference isn't huge, it's enough where this still looks like a CG model, and this is starting to look more like an animal. But you can see I have a long way to go. Unlikely that I'll get it all done tonight. Taking a look at the face of this animal, it's really kind of cool. Let's look at my reference, because it looks like I'm just pulling stuff out of the thin air, but in fact I'm being somewhat faithful, or I might not be, spot for spot faithful, but you can see how I had to go through a pass where I painted these types of colors and details on here. This is still unfinished, and I think this is looking a little bit better. And then after I painted all of that, I had to go on back and paint these kind of white decals. This is really wild, and you can see they also have this kind of black outline. In some places it kind of fades out, in some places it's a little bit harder edge, but what a wild detail. I mean, it looks like war paint, I didn't go crazy in the detail down here. I probably should add a little bit more detail. It's hard to determine what the anatomy of the nose of these things is. I mean, that's about as good as a reference as I can get. Just a blurry image of this weird snout. But I love that kind of war paint. And the eyes on these things are really ambiguous too. It has this kind of cup, and here's the eye right here, and so I've tried to emulate that right there, but probably use a little bit more work on it. From far away though, it looks pretty good. This would be a fun one to rig. Maybe not. Probably rig it with a lattice, add a few other deformers, and call it a day. Oh, you know what? I'm missing a piece of the anatomy. So I don't have this spot coming through right here. That's a bummer. Let's see if that's something that's universal. Maybe I can find an excuse for not having it. It doesn't look like it's on here. I don't see necessarily, it's hard to tell, but I don't see one coming out of there. I mean, it looks like there's a certain amount of variation, so maybe I can get away with not having it. I like to make sure, yeah, because this one, he's got this guy right here coming out, but I'm not seeing that other stem. I could always kind of maybe stick it in later. Yeah, I'm not, okay, so I'm going to say it's okay for now that I don't have that. I always like to, if I see a detail like that, I like to compare it with other images of the same organism just to make sure it's not something that needs to be there, but you can see how much variation there is in these guys. This one's got some crazy stuff coming out there, and can't even see its eyes. So I think that's okay. I like to make sure I'm justified. Look at how long these guys are coming down. I do have those. I don't know how many species there are of leafy sea dragons, if it's just one species or just a few species or what. I haven't done my due diligence and research on this thing because I just wanted to play around with doing something non-buggy for a change, just for a little change of pace. This guy's got really big lobes coming off of this. Look at that. This guy must be king of the leafy sea dragons because he's really elaborate. And this kind of crown is cool. What I might do is, you know, if I'm going to send this over to like Maya to render, I'll probably do a deformer, like a curved deformer on this thing to give it a little bit of a S-curve. But I don't feel like doing that quite yet. I want to kind of get the painting in a better place before I do that. But also I'll probably use maybe something like Transpose Master to do that. But let's take a break from painting for a second and see about making some UVs for this guy. So I'm going to minimize this. So at the lowest, and let's save it. So I'm going to save this as 32. Let me see if I have an earlier version of the model. It's probably one of these models that's migrated through several hard drives. I'll see the earliest versions. Okay. There you go. This is how it looked like when I started. I believe I started with Z-spheres and I just kind of worked this out. And let's see, this is version 24, so that's probably, that's from April 2020. So I started this in March 2020. And then that one's actually looking almost complete there. So I don't know if I saved that many in-betweens. But if I remember correctly, what I did was, I don't know why I have all these polyspheres. These might be little branches. Oh yeah, okay. So you can see. I started to pull these out. Let's take a look at the topology. And I have to do like archaeology on my own models here. Oh, this is nice. Okay. I'm glad you asked this question. So let's bring up the visible count, turn off the polyframe, and turn off solo. So what I did, apparently, was I made the basic model, and then I made kind of a generic leaf and added it as a subtool, and then used Dynamesh to kind of incorporate it into the various parts of the model. I think I don't know if I still have that thing right there. And just kind of built it up from there, and then did a Dynamesh to pull the whole thing together. Let's see how this one looks. Yeah, so you can kind of see, and then at this point it was perfectly symmetrical, so I did do like probably a mirror and weld to get these to come together. And then where I spent all the time was, of course, going through here in these other versions and just kind of sculpting in the detail, which is the tedious part, but also the fun part. I don't always start with Z-spheres, but something like this, I think I started the basic. I always think like if it's an animal that has a lot of branching this kind of stuff, I'll start with Z-spheres, and a lot of the times I'll do that mainly as a way to establish the overall proportion, because I want to get the basic structure kind of mapped out and then add things on. I think this one, I just wanted that core piece and then added these on, because I have, let me see if I can find my other sea dragons in here. So I have a ruby sea dragon. So this one, I believe I actually had scan data given to me. Let's take a look. Yeah, so this is the scan data that I got from a client on this model. And I kind of cleaned it up a little bit and then created a base mesh kind of wrapping around that. And since this one is extremely rare, photographic images were hard to come by, but I did manage to find them, and this was the final model. I think I do have a poly-painted version of this though, so I don't know if this is final, but you can see it kind of sculpted in the detail based on photographic reference. And then that one started with scan data. And let's see, oh, okay, here's the poly-painted version. This one's really beautiful. There's a lot of subtlety in here, and let's make sure it's not the highest subdivision level. Yeah, there we go. So this one I took advantage of that detail to create some masks, and I'm going to pull it up, the final renders that I created from this one. So this is the final render done in Redshift for Maya. I think it's okay. I mean, it would be a bit more dynamic if it was a little bit posed better. And then the background objects are mostly Quixel Megascans. But this one, it has a good example of, you can see how I created an opacity map so that those fins, really simple opacity map, but it makes a huge difference to make those fins transparent. So there's that one, and then I also have this one, which is the common sea dragon. So you can see how that opacity map right there is really important, because even though it's only a couple parts of the model that are transparent, that's the thing that pumps up the believability and makes it more realistic. Basically the same Redshift scene. I don't know if I'm crazy about the render. I might do a few more passes at it. I mean, I got a little bit of atmospheric fog in there and some depth of field, but it still feels, I don't know, even if you look at photographs of these guys, they still look a bit unreal. But I'll probably play with this some more, but you know. So that's sea dragons for you. Ironically, I haven't done a sea horse. I don't know if that's ironic or not. That's just coincidentally. Alright, now I gotta find the version I was working on. There it is, I believe. Yes. Okay, so let's talk about creating some UVs, just to break things up. So, like I mentioned, I had this one, has 4 subdivision levels. The lowest subdivision level 1, is 600,000 points. Generally speaking, most of the time I like to have it much lower than that. If I can get it down below 10,000, that's great. Even lower is great. But for this one, it's so incredibly detailed, and I wanted to keep it one surface. And if I keep Z-remeshing, I start to lose parts of the geometry. In fact, I think I Z-remeshed pretty low, and then I had to go back and reconstruct a lot of these things, and I don't want to do that again. So let's see how well this works. We're going to test the limits of this computer. So the lowest version is 600,000, and I'm going to turn off polypaint. Let's get a white color in here and turn on my polygroups. So that's what my polygroups look like. So I'm going to use the polygroups as a way to create UV shells. Let's see how well that goes. It should be okay. I'll probably have a few stray ones, but that's all right. I think that'll be okay. These days you can be a little bit looser with UVs than you used to be able to. I think this one might be a disaster unwrapping this. That might be a little bit difficult. So it might be worth going in here and doing a few more polygroups so that this doesn't chug all night trying to unwrap that. So one thing I might do is I'm going to switch over to select lasso. I'm going to control shift click on this just to isolate this. So everything else is invisible. And then I'm going to find a poly loop like this one. Hold control and shift. So I'm using select lasso and I'm going to control shift click on that to hide that poly loop. Let's do the same thing over here. Let's do the same thing over here. Whoops. And I'm basically creating a little gap here between some of these more complex parts. Like I said, this topology is a Z remesh topology because I'm not crazy enough to try and do a hand topology of this thing, or maybe I'm just too lazy for it. But either way, the Z remesh has gotten good enough right now that I think it's okay. But I'm creating these little gaps here. Whoops. And I'll show you why in just a second. Yeah, it seemed like it's such a small part of the model a minute ago. Now it's like seeing like this massive headache. But as I create, as I create those little gaps, what I can do is now I can go down here to geometry, or sorry, polygroup, and do auto groups. And that's going to create a separate polygroup from each independent mesh. So even though I haven't deleted the polygons, I've just created a gap, auto groups is going to consider these two different meshes as long as those parts are hidden. Now, of course, the trick is if I control shift click on this to bring everything back, the entire model, you're going to see that there is kind of like, I have this little band here. So I can control shift click on this. It's going to hide everything. I'm control shift clicking on a point that's shared by these two polygroups. And now I can do is, and I know this is a laborious process, but it's worth it in the end. I'm going to isolate that, control W, now that it's its own polygroup. Or for all intents and purposes, it's its own. Oops, I guess it's already, it's a UV shell, essentially. So I'm using this method just as a way to, since the model is very complicated, just to make it a little bit easier to select these different parts. Because now I can go in here and say, all right. I mean, I suppose I could do that without creating little bands. But, I like to have, as neat as possible a border on each of the UV shells. Makes it easier for it to unwrap. I don't need to project polypaint first. I could do that later if I wanted to. It's probably slightly an overly complicated process for doing this. So let's do this instead. Let's go in here and just do shrink. And do that. Oops. Okay, but what I will do is I will save the model. I mean, this process when I'm just splitting it into polygroups is not going to affect the polypaint because the topology is still the same. But it's always good to double check and make sure it looks good. So let's save this real quick. So much ZBrush plugin help with set fast checking, not a final but temporary preview UV mesh to for concept presentation. Well, that's good. Good for them. I use the plugin. It seemed to be pretty good. So let's see. I'm going to go down here, go down a low subdivision level. And I'm going to try this, but if it takes too long, I'm going to kill it and come back and do it later because I don't want to do a live stream of sitting here watching the computer calculate. But I have saved the model, so I'll go in here and let's do UV master, turn off symmetry, turn on polygroups, and let's do an unwrap. I already had nature has already proofed my concept for me. What does proofing concepts mean? Yeah, it doesn't like it? Okay. So I think what I'm going to have to do is probably... I think what I'll do is, I'm not going to do this tonight because it's going to get a little too boring and technical, but I might have to do another Z-remesh, lower topology at some point, and then project the polypaint from that onto the final model, because I think this one is just too elaborate. Or I might even bring it into Maya and do something with UV in there. So I think it's a little bit too insane in terms of the topology, but we can focus on the poly painting anyways. It fast tracks the cutting up of UV islands. Well, you know, that's good. That's good to hear. I'm excited. I like some of this detail that I'm seeing right here, so I might bring some of that into this area, which is looking a little bit plain at the moment. So go right here and choose a darker color. It's too small, that's all. Let's go in here to stroke, and under lazy mouse, I'm going to reduce the lazy step, and maybe add a little stroke jitter in here. Bring down the RGB intensity. I think that alpha is too small. I mean, honestly, with a model that's not as complicated as this, polygroups works great for creating UV islands. I use it all the time, and for a lot of models I can get my UVs out in like a couple minutes, you know. It's just this model, I got a little bit carried away with the topology on here, and I don't feel like messing with it tonight. So what I might do is add a little variation in here. So I'm going to pick like maybe another shade of blue, maybe a slightly darker one, and turn on the gradient button. So that adds a little bit more color variation here in the stroke. It looks a little bit more natural. And then I'll probably go over this again with another spray stroke. See, I did a little bit about this before, so I'm going to zoom that out just a little bit. I like this sort of subsurface detail. Yeah, I actually did. You just allowed me to plug a video that I did for the Gnomon workshop. So I did this, created this one a few years ago. It's 2018, but it's basically Introduction to UV Toolkit. I'm in the process of finishing up my 3 volumes of Maya 2023 for the Gnomon Workshop Intro series. And once I finish that, I'm going to go back and update this one. But yeah, I use Maya a lot for UVing. What I do now, though, is I do a lot where I'll set up the basic UVs in ZBrush using polygroups, and I'm going to check out so much ZBrush. I have it on another machine. I don't have it on this machine, but I haven't played with their UV tools just to compare. But I'll do like a rough UV layout in ZBrush, then export that into Maya, and then use the UV toolkit to make any other adjustments, fix any problems, lay it out into UDIMs. I might use UDIMs on this one because it's so complicated. And then I'll bring all of that back into ZBrush, because I like to make sure that my ZBrush version and my Maya version are in sync with each other as much as possible. That way, because you can see a lot of these models I'll have kicking around for years, and sometimes they'll come in handy on a project, or maybe just a personal project. but you know, I want to make sure that the ZBrush version and the Maya version are as in sync as much as possible, so I can come back and use them again. But that's basically how I set up my UVs. It's mostly Maya and ZBrush. I haven't used Blender's UV tools very much, but I'll probably get into that at some point. I like to experiment with different programs as much as I can, just so, you know, I have a lot of knowledge of different tools. It also makes it easier when I work at different studios and they have different packages there. Most of the time it's Maya and ZBrush, but okay, I'm messing this up. This looks kind of crappy. That's all right. I'll go over it again. I'll bring some of this stuff up. So the reason that I like to do, I like to paint in ZBrush because, as I mentioned earlier, I like the brushes better in ZBrush, honestly, because the smooth brush becomes this really wonderful blur brush. You see how I can blur that in there and it starts to look much more subsurface. And it's also faster. I mean, this is a 40 million model. I don't know how I'd paint that in Photoshop. But I just like painting directly on it in ZBrush. It's also, I've been poly painting for so long that I've built up so many techniques, even though it looks like I don't know what I'm doing right now, I actually do, that I'm more used to it. And like I said, I haven't successfully made UVs for this model yet, so I'll probably do that offline because I don't want to bore the hell out of people watching my machine crash all night. But my other go-to for texturing is I use Substance Painter, and I also use Marmoset Tool Bag. So my most recent video for the Gnomon Workshop was the Orchid Mantis, which I do in ZBrush, and I poly paint in ZBrush, but I also use Marmoset Tool Bag for texturing in that. And the texturing tools in Marmoset, the newest version of Marmoset, are kind of similar to Painter. In a way, you have layers and that kind of stuff, and you paint different channels. I think I got a little carried away there. It's neat. So that's another case where I like to kind of play around with different tools and see what you can do with them. But Marmoset's nice because it's easy to use and it has a nice fast ray traced render built into it, and it's really good for doing game models. So I'm going to go over this. I'm going to select like this yellow, maybe a greenish color. Let's select a greenish color. Bring down my RGB intensity and kind of just knock this back a little bit so it's not so in your face. Do a little bit of blending there. I don't stop poly painting until I just can't take it anymore, because you could just do this stuff forever on any model. There's just so much. The more you look at these things, the more detail you see, the more variations. I mean, there's purples, oranges, yellows, greens, everything in here. So it's just, every time I look at the reference, I see new things that I kind of want to bring into the model. Like up here at the top, really kind of bring in that kind of color as well. I'll probably do that to opaque this. Kind of bring in a little bit of, oh, time to drink a beer. What I like to do, I mean, I was working on, the last time I did a live stream a couple weeks ago, I was still working on that camel spider. Not really a spider, but the sulfugid. So I was hoping today that I was going to go in and just finish the model, so you don't have to watch me do every appendage over and over again. But unfortunately, I had too much work to do for clients, so I wasn't able to do that. So I thought I'd take a break from that and just work on this a little bit. So So what I'll try and do before the next time I do a live stream in a couple weeks is, if I can get some time, I'm going to go in and kind of work out that model a little bit more, get some more detail offline, and then finish it up online, and I'll do some poly painting on that. So that one, I'll do poly painting from the beginning, so if you want to see my process from the very beginning all the way to the end, I'll try and do that. So this is cool, but it's getting a little bit too granular. So another thing I like to do is, it's getting too smooth. This is starting to get too smooth. So I'm going to switch to this alpha 40, and bring up my RGB intensity quite a bit. And maybe let's choose a different color, like this yellow or something, a lighter color, just to see how this looks. I kind of like to go over it and oops, RGB intensity, not Z intensity. Thank you. That's too much. And let's increase the placement a little bit. So just to add in a little bit of a noise here on top of everything else. That's too subtle. Here we go. Again, to kind of give the impression that it's a subsurface kind of detail. And yeah, because I really like the way this is looking right here. Like, this is too grainy CG noise for me. This is too smooth, but this right here is a nice in-between. Maybe I'll blur that a little bit and then go over it again. But now these colors are starting to blend a bit more. This is definitely some techniques that I've copped from Madeline Spencer from way back in the day. And Madeline learned them from working at Gentle Giant, from working with practical modelers who were airbrushing actual models, and has just basically adapted their techniques into ZBrush, and it works really well. I think that's the other thing about why I like poly painting in ZBrush, because poly painting in ZBrush to me feels, even though I don't do a whole lot of practical painting, it still feels more organic and less CG than other approaches. It feels like I'm actually using an airbrush. What's really tricky is painting bugs that are hairy. I mean, the nice thing about this guy is he's not hairy at all. He's lacking detail though. I need to bring in some detail there, but let's go over to this side and play with this a little bit, because now my sides don't match at all, but that's okay. The nice thing about this one is it's hard to see both sides at the same time, so it's whatever side is facing the camera, that's what you're going to see. Oops. Let's bring down RGB intensity a bit. But I want to bring back some sculpted detail in there, because this is looking too smooth. Before I do that, let's knock this down a little bit. Yeah, it's like I'm trying to bury those lines just a little bit beneath the surface. Let's do this. I'm going to take my TWSK cloth brush. A little bit more even than that. Maybe a little bit more fidgety detail in there. I'm not even sure what these things are made of in real life. I mean, what is their skin actually made of? Because it's not like fish scales, and it's certainly not like a crustacean. It'd be interesting to find out. Anybody who's a sea dragon expert out there that knows what type of cells they use. It's like with insects, you know, their exoskeletons are made up of chitin, which is a bit like similar to the surface that makes up your fingernails, but they also have a lot of pigments in them. And what's really cool about insects, especially the shiny ones, the shiny beetles, is you see that iridescence and that metallic quality on their surface. That's actually an artifact of the structure of the way that the layers of the exoskeleton accumulate as the insect grows and molts. The cells, or the structure at the cellular level of that exoskeleton, is kind of in a corkscrew pattern, and that corkscrew pattern actually has a three-dimensional quality to it. Refracts light in such a way as to create that shininess and that iridescent quality. It's a really cool kind of thing. The nice thing about the metallic bugs is they're very easy to simulate in CG, right? Because we have metalness and we use physically based shaders, and so it's not too hard to kind of create that quality. But, you know, learning about what the surface, what the cells actually are, can help you understand how to make the colors and the details on it. But since I don't know that much about sea dragons, all I know is that they have some kind of skin, and that skin has some kind of pigment on it. Another trick I've learned is sometimes it's like if I'm working on an animal like this and it's like either one side or the other and I start to lose track of which way the lines are going, one thing I can do is I'm gonna just do this. I'll move this off to the side here and zoom in like this, and I'm going to press Shift S, which just drops a copy to the canvas so that I have that in the background and I can work on this side of the model, and it gives me a kind of a reference for what I did on this side so I don't lose track of it, because it's kind of easy to do sometimes with this kind of critter. That way I don't have to constantly look over here. That's from the old days of ZBrush being a 2.5D illustration program. So when I first encountered ZBrush, it was in, I think, 2000, and I was at a Macworld in New York. Might have even been summer of 2001, which, as you can tell, New York changed a lot a few months after that. But I was in a Macworld with some friends, and there was a little booth in the back, weird little company called Pixelogic, and I believe it was O'Fair who was actually giving the demo himself. And it was a 2.5D illustration program, and it looked very wacky. And at that time I was really into Lightwave, That was my main 3D program. But I was frustrated by the fact that everybody was promising true organic modeling, but nobody quite delivered yet. You're still using either NURBS or subdivision surfaces, but nothing that really quite felt like sculpting. So when I saw ZBrush being demoed, I thought, this is it, man. But it was still a 2.5D illustration program, so it was a little bit on the gimmicky side. Ah! Earthquake! Sorry. So I got a demo disc of it, and I remember I was taking the train from New York back to Washington, D.C., which is where I lived at the time. And I played with the demo on my laptop on the way home. I said, this is cute, but it's not a real 3D program, and I forgot all about it. And then, was it Lord of the Rings came out? This was, I think it was Return of the King. And I remember I was reading a Cinefex about how they did the effects in Return of the King, and they were talking about the King of the Dead when Aragorn meets the King of the Dead and has that lovely conversation. And Cinefex mentioned that it was like they used ZBrush for that, and I flipped out because I was like, no, they did. There's no way. ZBrush, all you could do was make a mess on the screen. That's all ZBrush was good for at the time, at least that I thought. But several years had gone by between when I went to that Mac world and when Return of the King came out, and of course they were using it a lot at Weta. I just remember, I don't think I even finished reading the article. I had downloaded the demo of ZBrush and started learning it right away, like that day. A long time ago, but ZBrush was still really different back then. So you kids and your subtools and your Decimation Master, not like back in my day. Yeah, we had Projection Master, and there was no poly painting, no UVs. It's a different world, man. But still been my favorite 3D program ever since then. I feel like I lost some of the cool stuff that I had going on the other side. I suppose I could use an extractor brush just to grab that and throw it on here. Ah, yes, good old Lightwave. That was a good program too for a while. I really liked it. And then I got into Moto as well a lot. Lightwave had one of the best modelers for the longest time. And it was also inexpensive. So I was working at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute doing a lot of scientific animations. Just still one of my favorite things to do. And this Howard Hughes Medical Institute, so they had a huge budget, a massive budget. So we had a SGI machine at work, and so I was able to use Maya at work. So this is like Maya version 1, which at the time was like cost like $16,000 or something. I mean, it was an insane amount of money for a software program, but it was way back when, 1999, I think, actually. But at home, I used Lightwave, and the modeler in Lightwave, and the renderer in Lightwave was awesome. In many ways superior to Maya, because it took a long time for Maya to actually get decent polygons. Started out with NURBS, and then it had polygons in like version 2.5 to 3 or whatever, But it really took them a long time to get their act together and make a polygon modeler that was even close to being as good as Lightwave. And then Lightwave's rendering was also way ahead of Maya, because Maya software was like garbage, and still is to this day garbage. Yeah, is Brad Peebler still working at Modo, or Modo is owned by what guys who own Nuke, right? I lost track of all that stuff. I like Modo, but I haven't used it in a long time. The problem with Modo and also Lightwave was, to me, in my opinion, and you may disagree with me, it's totally fine, was I didn't really like their animation tools. That's where they kind of fell short. And the whole thing with Lightwave switching between the modeler to the animator, animation program, the layout or whatever, that just, it always seemed to bug the crap out of me. But I did some animations in Lightwave. It's still a good program. I have a friend who still uses Lightwave professionally. He does amazing stuff. Billy Brooks is a very excellent animator, although he's become an Unreal expert recently. Billy Brooks, his claim to fame is that he worked on episode 2 of Star Wars and invented, or I should say designed, the jets that R2-D2 uses, that they pop out of his legs. Those are known as the Brooks jets, Brooks engines or whatever in the Star Wars canon, so it's kind of funny. But I worked with Billy at Otoy a few years ago, and we're still really good friends. I had lunch with him the other day. He's an amazing artist, a really wonderful guy too. And he's also, Billy has built his own life-size functioning R2 units, R2-D2. He was in a club, you guys might be in those clubs too, where people would get together and build their own R2 units, and Grant Imahara was a member of that club before he passed away. Does this look stupid, or is it working? I don't know. Let's see. It looks better than it did before. Nobody asked you. Yeah, Moto did kind of lose contact with the industry. I agree, or the community. And I don't know. It's just evolution of software, I did some really cool models in Moto, or I did a lot of ZBrush to Moto work and some nice renders. I had a hard time with their animation tools as well. Like, I did a whole jumping spider animation in Moto, and I even used their fur system, and I rigged it in Moto, and then when I went to render it, things just fell apart. The randomly uncertain frames, the fur on the spider would fly off into the distance, and it was just too frustrating. I had limbs that would fly off and reattach, and you wouldn't notice it until the render. It was like, I don't know, man, it was not good. So at that point I was like, I'm just going to go and do this in Maya, because I know it'll work in Maya. I think from far away it looks pretty good. This might need some work up here, but it looks better than just being perfectly smooth, and this is starting to look better. If you compare it with this right here, which is still, I think this right here compared to this is really, you can see what a difference just shifting a few things around makes. I used to get headaches learning Lightwave. Yeah, Lightwave was great up until you had to animate or rig something, and then it was like headache city. This particular guy, as you can see, has got kind of he's a little bit different here. My version of him is different, but I think that variation is acceptable within the species. I think, it's like certain bugs. A blue morpho butterfly, for example, they always have 2 white dots in the same spot on the wing. Every single blue morpho has one. I always look at CG blue morpho butterflies, and that's one thing that CG artists always miss. but it's very, very specific, and every blue morpho has it right there. But then other animals, you know, there's like all kinds of variation. Like, is this lobe present exactly in this configuration in every single? I'm not really seeing it. It's not. Yeah, it's different there. We have a bump right there, but not necessarily there. And then, yeah. And so I think there is some variation. So I usually, you can see. I mean, it's kind of similar. So I always like to try and double check and make sure that I'm getting it right. Because I always have some scientist friend somewhere that's going to point out every mistake that I make. Some people don't care. It bothers me when I get things wrong. But that's the only way to learn, really. Yeah, if I'm doing like an original creature design or something like that, then yes, I'm all about embracing happy mistakes. If I'm doing an organism based in the real world, then I like to get things right. But then, you know, sometimes I obsess about it, and I remember that, you know, especially with some of these animals that are pretty rare, not that many people have knowledge of how they work, so I was hanging out with some of my spider expert friends who are lovely people. I remember I was asking, it was Thomas Shahan, who's one of my favorite people. And he was giving a lecture on jumping spider anatomy, which is something he's an expert on. I was asking him about, you know, in the entire world, you know, considering there is some 9 billion or so of us Homo sapiens in the world, of those 9 billion people, how many experts, real, truly experts, are there in jumping spiders? There might be 100 out of 9 billion people. So there's only so many people out there that could tell me that I'm getting something wrong. But those are the people I obsess about. When it comes to sea dragons, there's probably even less than 100 people that are true experts on their anatomy and biology and stuff. Because there's not much money in being a sea dragon expert, although you probably get a fair amount of scuba diving experience doing it. It's always funny whenever they have like ads or whatever stories and little kids want to be scientists, they always want to be marine biologists. You very rarely see one of these little kids saying, I want to be an expert in scorpions when I grow up. But, you know, you're much more likely to encounter a scorpion in your day-to-day life than, say, a sea dragon. Or even a dolphin. I mean, unless you do a lot of surfing. At this point, I'm rambling. Well, I've introduced him enough. be interesting to meet an expert on tumbleweeds. I wonder if there's any tumbleweed experts out there. People really know the botany, evolution of tumbleweeds. How do tumbleweeds make other tumbleweeds? Any tumbleweed farmers out there? Oh yeah, so I mentioned that earlier. I do a lot of painting in Substance Painter. I like Substance Painter just fine. I like Marmoset. But I like to do the initial poly paint, the diffuse albedo, base color, whatever you want to call it, in ZBrush, mainly because I like the painting tools, and I really like the blur tools and the spatter tools. I like the paint brushes in ZBrush better. But when it comes to baking out maps, whether it's normal, displacement, curvature, etc., that's when I generally bring the model into Substance or Marmoset or something like that. And I'll finish it off and do the roughness maps and that kind of thing in Substance Painter, and I'll use the procedural tools and that kind of stuff. But the other reason is that this is a ZBrush live stream and not a Substance one. So I'm going to do ZBrush stuff when I demo. How's that for a non-answer? But yeah, I like Substance just fine. I liked it a little bit better before Adobe got it, but you know, whatever. What can you do? Resistance is futile. See, there's like this spot of orange in there. I gotta get that in there. I have it down here. Some dark colors and more of this veining. This is hard to see because this is, I think, this is the base of the fin, but the fin itself is transparent, so it's a little bit hard to see what's going on there. So I might have to do a little creativity there. Yeah, I've become a real fan of Marmoset lately. I like it also because, again, it's kind of like, I feel like Marmoset is wired into the community a little bit better. I think this is a small company. I don't know much about the company itself, but they do seem to be, you know, very concerned about their user base and trying to keep their tools in line with what's going on. The problem with like big companies like Adobe, they make great products. Substance is a great product. But I mean, Billie Eilish is doing their computers, really? I haven't seen Billie Eilish working in any of these studios that I've had to work at. I'm sure she's fine, but the fact that she's doing their spokesperson for their graphic design, she hasn't had to deal with the shit that I've had to deal with. I'm sure she's had to deal with a lot of shit in the music industry, but you guys know, when it comes to doing CG and clients and jobs and all that kind of stuff, you really had to understand what this industry requires of you in order to really get what the tools need to do. I'm rambling a lot right now. I have nothing against Billie Eilish. I'm sure she's wonderful. But it seems weird to have her as advertising Adobe products. What the hell do I know, man? I know nothing. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is Adobe is appealing to a very broad market beyond us working slobs in the CG industry. And so I think because of that, it's possible, I'm not saying that they do, but it's possible that they start to lose touch with their user base. And what I like about Marmoset and why I've been more enthusiastic about working with that particular tool is it seems to be more in touch with people like me and what we need out of the program. Of course, I think it needs, I haven't updated the latest version. I think I'm like a version behind or something. I'm at version 4, but maybe a release behind. So I would like to see them implement better UDIM support, painting across UDIMs. It took a long time for Substance to really integrate that. So I'm not surprised that maybe they've implemented it. I don't know. It's been a few weeks since I've used it. So, but it's a cool program. Let's get some of this weird veining going again down here. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I think I'm going to do this. That's kind of cool. It's like overlaying light stripes on top of dark stripes. It'd be kind of a cool effect. If I don't screw it up. I don't know what this, I mean, this, what the hell, you know. Blurry photographs. Clearly I need to, you know, book a ticket to Australia and do some scuba diving and get my own damn reference. Or maybe just go to an aquarium. I need to go to the aquarium in Monterey is where I need to go. I've been wanting to do that for a while now. I went to, speaking of random stories that have nothing to do with anything, if you've ever seen that show on Netflix, Penguin Town, it's a great show, narrated by Patton Oswalt. They follow these penguins in South Africa. So back in 2018, my wife and I took a trip and went to South Africa, which is a fantastic place to visit, especially Cape Town. But we went and we visited the same penguin sanctuary that's featured in Penguin Town. It's called Sand Cobb. I follow them on Instagram. It's such a really cool place. It's like a little hospital, and they rescue seabirds. And we took a little tour, and it wasn't quite open to the public, so we managed to get a very private tour, which was nice. But they literally were like, it was like a hot, like the show ER or Grey's Anatomy, like a little emergency room where they're like had gurneys going around and doctors and stuff, but on the gurneys was penguins. It wasn't people. It was a little hospital. I mean, like that should be an awesome show, like a penguin ER. But they let us sit in and watch penguin surgery. So I got to see a penguin get his broken foot repaired, and you know they rehabilitate the birds there. And we got to see penguin chicks being it was really cool. I highly recommend checking them out on Instagram. We saw another one where the penguin had lost its eye, so it was, you know, shark attack or something like that. So they were doing surgery on the poor thing. It's okay though. They rehabilitated him. Yes, Marmoset has the best baking. Absolutely, 100% agree. I think the baking is even better than Substance. The baking is really, because you really have better control over it. Or I find the controls easier to use than in Substance. And that's the So this is the one that I did. This is orchid mantis. So this is a rendered in Marmoset as well. So there, and not much post process. I mean, these are Quixel Megascan flowers, so they look a little CG on the edges. But for doing a demonstration, so this guy was modeled and poly painted in ZBrush, and then finished and rendered in Marmoset. And I think this came out really nicely. I was really pleased with that. And the subsurface is really great. I thought that came out really nicely. Translucency. So, and this is actually workshop series, Noma Workshop. If you're interested, if you're a member, I go through the entire process from Z-spheres all the way to final render in only 22 short chapters. So you can check that out. It's an orchid mantis, one of my favorite critters. And I even ramble on aimlessly about mantis anatomy, so which I know a little bit more about than I do sea dragons. That's looking pretty good though. See, the variation is looking much better from far away. I don't know if the sides matched that well, but like I said, you have to look at both sides at the same time to really tell. I always have to remember that it has to look good from here. That's the important thing. It doesn't have to look perfect from here. I always end up painting at that level, and I'm like, it looks like crap, and I'm like, well, no, I'm not going to render it that close because that's ridiculous. Nobody asked you. Sorry, my dog's grumbling in the background. Let's do a little bit of this kind of thing right here. I'd hate to be a seahorse and run into one of these things. Imagine being a seahorse and thinking, man, I'm so cool. I look like a horse. I got little fins. I'm in the ocean. And Aquaman is my friend. And then you come across this thing. And it's like, yeah, seahorse, I'm a sea dragon. And beyond that, I'm a leafy sea dragon. Maybe seahorses look at these things like, that's a god. I'll never be as cool as that guy. I don't know what eats leafy sea dragons, but considering they obviously value their ability to camouflage, or at least evolution has given them the advantage of this kind of camouflage, they must have something that eats them a lot. Alright, so I got like 10 minutes left on this. I'll smooth that out a little bit. I have no idea how long it's going to take me to get this whole thing detailed. But this is one of those things that's like kind of a fun lunchtime project. Since I don't have a deadline on it, and I'm just doing it for myself. It doesn't really bother me. I did see on Instagram somebody recently I think it was a team of people did just an absolutely fantastic CG coral reef. I mean, I was extremely envious of how good it came out. Really, really amazing stuff. I think it was featured on one of the NVIDIA page or something like that. Sea dragons eat plankton, shrimp, and small fish. What eats them, though? Is my clicking on the tablets becoming annoying in terms of the audio, I apologize. But that's basically the way I move. I could be one of those chainsaw artists. They make a lot more noise. Sculpting with a chainsaw. I think this has gotten a little bit out of hand. Yes, that's really bad. The oceans are in a lot of trouble right now. The coral reefs are in super bad trouble. Basically, plankton are the bottom of the food chain, and we're running out of plankton, then everything that goes up from there. I hate the term food chain. It's really food web, not food chain. Food chain is basically part of a food web, so think of it that way. But in any case, obviously, other parts of the food web are going to start to collapse. That's not good. But you had to understand that we could fix these things if we really wanted to. It's the political will that is lacking. It's not the technology. There's plenty of cool technologies out there. The problem is getting them to market and getting people to actually accept them. You have inertia, and also you have a lot of people who make a lot of money with the older technologies, and they're not exactly keen on bringing the new technology to market, which is unfortunate. There's a really cool website called Eureka Alert. It's put out by, I believe it's sponsored by AAAS, and it's basically is a newsletter that brings you into the latest scientific and technological breakthroughs in the previous month or previous week, and there's some really cool stuff in there. You look at material science. I mean, you have basically, bricks that are solar power generators that are sensitive enough to generate power from ambient light and all kinds of crazy crap. There's insects that can, and beetle larvae that can eat and dissolve plastic and styrofoam. There's definitely a lot of solutions out there that are really cool, but unfortunately they need to be implemented, and that's the part we're having trouble with. I think, plankton, I think, is for the most part kind of a generic term for all kinds of just tiny little organisms so I think it is definitely possible that we could farm and replenish the plankton supply. I know there's a lot of interesting things with like seaweed development and that kind of stuff. You could feed seaweed to livestock and it reduces their methane output dramatically. And that's not going to change. I personally have been vegetarian for like almost 30 years, but for those of you who do eat meat, it's not going to change the way you enjoy meat if the cow is eating seaweed, right? So why don't we do things like that? I don't know. Would be nice. But I'm not going to get into politics. I'm here to talk about ZBrush. Science is led by what the PhDs are motivated to be funded with. Unfortunately, students get really... Yeah, I mean, I had the good fortune to work with a lot of really great scientists, including Nobel Prize winning scientists over the years. And it's true to extent, like, there's definitely more funding for cancer than a lot of things. That's where the money is, right? Because that's something we're very interested in. Whereas spider research, again, like I mentioned earlier, not a real high priority unless they decide that there's a spider venom that's useful in cancer research, right? So, yeah, it's unfortunate the way that pure science is hard to get funding for. And one of the things I liked about working with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute way back when, and it is a very good organization, even though it was founded by a crazy man who wore Kleenex boxes on his feet and saved bar jars of his own urine, the organization itself really works hard at funding science for the sake of science. It's a private organization, is not funded by the government. It's funded basically by investments based on Howard Hughes' original fortune. And but they've done incredible things. They were the biggest scientific research medical organization before Bill Gates Foundation came along in 2000. That's about the time I was working there. And they have a really cool facility in Virginia called Genelia Farms, and it is basically like the Bell Labs of biomedical research. And the idea is that if you're a scientist and you have really good ideas and you win funding through their program, through their applying and that kind of stuff, they'll actually set you up with the lab and equipment at Genelia Farms that you need to do your research, and even the support team. You have to be really good. Your idea has to be really solid. Obviously, they're not just going to give money to any kook who comes in there. But they've been focusing a lot on imaging the human brain, seeing how and that kind of stuff, cell biology and that kind of thing. Really cool stuff there. You should look them up. Where I worked in their Bethesda headquarters, Bethesda, Maryland, just down the street from NIH. And the first jobs that I had in CG way back then was creating animations that illustrated the scientific concepts of some of their top scientists, and the animations were meant for the general public. So I learned a lot from that. And I met a lot of really cool scientists that way. I met a few jerks too, but I met some really cool ones as well. I might have taken that green a bit too far. I don't know. It looks okay. I think I lost some of the detail. Well, that's why we have undo history. Let's research human night vision. You don't know. Maybe they got probably come up with some interesting ways to genetically modify the retina. And then, of course, that leads to zombies, because everything leads to zombies, right? Okay, it's 8:59, so I'm wrapping up for this evening. I really want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening to me ramble incoherently while I ruin the paint on this model. So I will be streaming again 2 weeks from tonight, I think, although I don't know if it's on the schedule yet. And I'll either continue working with this, or I'll bring back the camel spider. I hope to get a little bit more done, some of the more tedious stuff done on the camel spider, and maybe do some decent UVs for this thing. Then I'll continue that, or some other critter, depending on what's going on. So, what plugin is that? Which plugin are you referring to? One of the plugins that I was able to do temporary quick UVs. Oh, that's so much ZBrush or so much monsters. So much ZBrush. Yeah, that is a cool plugin. I haven't played with that, but I'll definitely check that out, because I need to get my workflow faster to get into Unreal. Cool. Thanks, guys. See you next time.